In a world where wealth often overshadows wisdom and entitlement, quietly poisons gratitude, there lived a woman whose story could inspire a generation. Her name was Adesua, a formidable matriarch whose entire life was defined by resilience. From the outside, she was known as Mama Cash and carried a name that echoed through markets, boardrooms, and business expos across Nigeria. But behind the nickname was a life of struggle, grit, and fierce devotion to her family. Now, before we dive into the heartbreaking moment when her own children turned against her, let's rewind to understand how a woman so powerful, so generous, so committed to her legacy could be betrayed by the very people she raised from the ground up. Adesua came from humble beginnings. The daughter of a petty trader, she grew up watching her mother battle poverty with dignity. She didn't attend prestigious schools, nor did she inherit any family fortune. What she had was ambition, an unmatched work ethic, and a deep understanding that if she didn't build her life, no one else would. So she began where many dreamers start at the bottom, selling household goods from a wheelbarrow in the bustling streets of Lagos. She saved every naira, reinvested every profit, and slowly turned a barrow into a kiosk into a stall, and eventually a stall into a supermarket. By her mid-30s, she owned three mini-marts, and by her 40s, she was the proud owner of a chain of wholesale depots across the Southwest with her face plastered on billboards and her voice featured in radio jingles. She became a household name, but despite all that success, her heart was never in the fame. It was always in her children. Tosin and Teniola, her pride and joy, or so she thought, she raised them in comfort, sent them to the best schools, paid for overseas trips, and gave them everything she never had, but in doing so, she may have given them too much and demanded too little. She assumed they would learn responsibility through exposure, that they would watch her work ethic and naturally absorb it. But real life has shown us again and again that wealth without wisdom is a ticking time bomb, and in Adesua's case, that bomb would eventually explode. Her son Tosin was the classic image of wasted potential, handsome, intelligent, but addicted to the fast life. He fancied himself an entrepreneur, but every business he touched crumbled from poor planning and reckless spending, from opening a luxury shoe line with no supply chain to investing in a restaurant with no chef. He burned through over 150 million of his mother's money. Within 5 years, her daughter Teniola wasn't any better obsessed with social media. She hopped from influencer gigs to failed skincare lines, always chasing clout, but never building character. She posted pictures in private jets borrowed for an hour, while her bills at home went unpaid. She became popular for being popular, but accomplished nothing substantial each time they failed. Adesua would step in with a bailout and a lecture, but neither stuck. And if this reminds you of stories you've heard in real life, you're not wrong. How many parents around the world have built empires from scratch only to watch their children inherit assets, but not values? How many hardworking mothers and fathers believe that love means giving without boundaries, only to learn that enabling is not affection, it is erosion, the erosion of accountability and purpose. Adesuwa's story is the cautionary tale we rarely hear in full, because no one wants to talk about parental heartbreak when the heartbreak comes not from strangers, but from the blood you nurtured. And this is where the story takes a sharp turn. Tired of cleaning up after her children's failures, she devised a plan, one last lesson, the most brutal one. She would pretend to be broke. She told them her businesses had collapsed, that debts had consumed everything, and that she had no money left to offer. In a matter of weeks, her children changed. Tosin stopped calling. Teniola became cold and distant. No one asked how she was coping. They only asked what she could still give. Then came the day they truly crossed the line. Her children held a private meeting without her and agreed that their mother was now a liability. They decided to evict her from her own home, a mansion she had built brick by brick with her hands and heart. They packed her belongings into cheap nylon bags and told her to find somewhere else to stay. They claimed it was for her safety, but it was for their comfort. They no longer saw her as a mother, but as a burden, and that moment would have broken a lesser woman. But Adesua had not survived slums, business betrayals, and societal judgment to be crushed by entitlement. Instead, she left quietly smiling, knowing that the test had revealed the truth, and what she did next would shock everyone. Adesua walked out of her own home, not with shame, but with silent calculation in her heart. She had finally seen her children, not as she hoped they would be, but as they were entitled, ungrateful, and shockingly disloyal. And she knew it was time to reclaim control of her legacy, while the world around her remained unaware of the drama unfolding in that mansion. She began to make quiet, powerful moves behind the scenes. First, she went to her trusted lawyer, a man who had handled her business paperwork for over 2 decades, and gave him new instructions. Rewrite my will, remove the children entirely, and transfer the majority of my wealth into a charitable foundation. Those were her words. With calm clarity and no hesitation, her lawyer paused, stunned. But he saw the fire in her eyes and understood. This was no ordinary case of family disagreement. This was about justice. It was about drawing a boundary between generosity and foolishness. The new foundation was designed to support young women from underprivileged backgrounds, teaching them business skills, financial literacy, and personal development. Everything she had once needed but never received. The rest of her assets were placed in trusts tied to milestone-based rewards, not for her children but for deserving youths who proved their responsibility and integrity. Within a month, the paperwork was finalized. Her ownership of the mansion was quietly reinforced legally, making it impossible for her children to sell, lease, or alter the property without her approval. And then came the moment that shifted the narrative forever. She returned to her home unannounced, flanked by legal officials and police protection. Her children were lounging by the pool, sipping imported wine, and filming social media content when they saw her. They laughed, assuming she had come crawling back instead. They were handed eviction notices and informed that the property was never legally transferred to them, that they had no rights over it, and had 72 hours to vacate at their own expense. Shock turned to anger, then to pleading, and finally to outrage. Adesua stood tall. She looked each of them in the eye and said, "I gave you everything: love, comfort, education, money, and what did you give me? Disrespect. You spat on my sacrifice. Now I give you freedom, freedom to become who you are without my help." And with that, she walked past them into the house, not looking back. And if this story feels dramatic or extreme, let me offer a real-life parallel. Similar to the case of Leona Helmsley, the American businesswoman dubbed the Queen of Mean, who famously cut her family out of her fortune and left millions to her dog. Trouble shocking the public at the time. But behind that bizarre decision was a similar story of disappointment, betrayal, and the realization that legacy must be protected, not just distributed. And Adesua's choice was no less calculated. While she didn't leave her money to a pet, she did entrust it to a future that was more promising than the past she had just severed. And yet she wasn't heartless. Within weeks, she transferred $20 million each to Tosin and Teniola with a simple note: "This is your final seed. Plant it wisely or waste it, but do not return." And at first, they rejected the money out of pride. But as bills piled up and friends vanished, they had no choice. Months passed and life became real for both siblings. Tosin tried to launch a new business but struggled without guidance. Teniola attempted to restart her influencer career, but found the internet had moved on. And with nowhere left to run, they came back, not with demands but with apologies, not with entitlement, but with tears. And Adesua listened, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to see if humility had finally touched them. They begged for forgiveness, for another chance. And she gave them one. But not with open arms, with open eyes. She said, "I forgive you, but the estate is gone. The wealth is no longer yours, but the seed is here again." And she wired them each another 20 million and said, "Go build something and prove that my love was not wasted." That moment was the true turning point for the family, not the eviction, not the betrayal, but the challenge, the chance to rewrite their stories through merit, not inheritance. And while both children stumbled in the beginning, they slowly began to mature. And this is an important lesson for all of us. Too often we think love is about endless support, about rescuing others from every mistake. But real love, especially parental love, is sometimes about stepping back and letting consequences do the teaching. Adesua had spent decades rescuing her children from reality when she finally let them fall. They learned how to stand, and that transformation could only come through pain, discomfort, and the freedom to fail. And try again, her foundation by then was flourishing. Thousands of young women were being trained, mentored, and funded, launching food brands, tech startups, tailoring shops and media firms, all built from the same principles. Adesua lived by grit, discipline, humility, and strategy, and media outlets began to notice. They hailed her not just as Mama Cash and Carrie, but as a new kind of icon, the woman who chose legacy over loyalty, who built an empire and then redefined what it meant to protect it. She was invited to speak at business forums, women's leadership conferences, and even universities, where she shared her journey with brutal honesty and inspiring courage. Months turned into years, and what began as a tragic story of betrayal slowly evolved into a profound journey of redemption. Adesua remained at the center not as a grieving mother, but as a determined visionary. Her foundation was now a household name, with offices in 4 major Nigerian cities and partnerships with international organizations like Women in Business Africa and Global Startup Grants. The media could not get enough of her transformation. Headlines called her the Iron Mother of Lagos, and business publications profiled her not just as an entrepreneur, but as a cultural reformer, challenging how African wealth was passed down and preserved. She didn't shy away from these narratives. She embraced them because she knew that too many African families were silently suffering from a similar affliction. The rise of generational wealth without generational discipline, a trend where the first generation works tirelessly, the second enjoys and the third destroys, and she was determined to stop. That cycle in her own home and beyond, in her public speeches, she often spoke about the need to distinguish between love and legacy. And she famously said, if you don't train your children to build, what will you leave them to inherit but rubble and memories? And this truth resonated across borders. Parents flooded her foundation with letters of support, requests for workshops, and even confessions of their own. Silent regrets. She had tapped into a universal fear that love, when not tempered with accountability, could lead to the ruin of everything you worked for back at home. Tosin and Teniola were slowly finding their footing for the first time in their lives. Were using their own hands to create value, not just consume it. Tosin partnered with a group of young fintech developers to create a budgeting app for low-income traders. Inspired by watching his mother struggle in her early days, he used part of his seed money to build a prototype and eventually landed a grant from a small incubator. And while his success wasn't meteoric, it was meaningful and earned. Not given. Teniola took a different path. She launched a podcast called From Clout to Clarity, where she interviewed former influencers who had rebranded into business owners, educators, or advocates. She spoke candidly about her own journey from fake photo shoots to finding purpose, and her vulnerability won her a loyal audience. Within a year, she was invited to speak at youth empowerment panels and even landed a brand ambassadorship, not for a fashion line, but for a mental health nonprofit. And for the first time in her life, she was known for substance, not spectacle. Both siblings still made mistakes because growth is never perfect, but they now had tools, not just money, and that made all the difference. They visited their mother occasionally. Each visit began awkwardly but ended with genuine hugs and hard conversations. Adesua made it clear that forgiveness was not an invitation back into her fortune, but a welcome into her life, and this boundary helped them all heal slowly and honestly. And if you think this kind of transformation is rare, consider the real-life example of Oprah Winfrey, whose early trauma did not define her, but whose deliberate self-work and boundaries allowed her to build a media empire without succumbing to generational dysfunction. She often speaks of how saying no was her most powerful growth tool, and Adesua embodied that same truth. She was not afraid to be misunderstood because she was committed to being impactful, and impact doesn't always come wrapped in softness. Sometimes it wears steel, and in the process, Adesua inspired a new generation of parents to reconsider what it means to love. Wisely, her story was added to case studies in business ethics and family leadership courses across Nigeria. Her face appeared on the covers of magazines with the caption, "From Riches to Respect," and people started calling her home not a mansion but a sanctuary, because it had become a symbol not of wealth but of values. And as she aged gracefully, she spent more time mentoring, sitting with young women who came from nothing, just like she once did. She told them the truth that love can build, but it can also blind. That legacy without responsibility is a trap, and that the true measure of wealth is not in what you leave behind, but in who you raise and how they carry your name. And as she told these stories, she began to write her own memoir, a book filled with lessons, regrets, and revelations, not for profit, but for purpose. A blueprint for anyone trying to balance love and leadership, grace and grit. And in the last chapter of her book, she shared the moment that still haunted her. Not the eviction, not the betrayal, but the years she spent hoping her children would change without ever confronting them. And she wrote, sometimes the silence of a parent becomes the permission for a child's downfall. I stayed silent for too long, and it almost cost me everything. But silence is no longer my legacy, strength is. And with those words, her story came full circle. As Adasua's legacy crystallized into something far more enduring than property titles or bank balances, her focus turned toward long-term impact and sustainability. She didn't just want to build a foundation that handed out funds, she wanted to reshape the cultural mindset that celebrated wealth without honoring the grind behind it. She launched a nationwide campaign titled Earn Before You Enjoy, a movement that encouraged schools, religious groups, and families to talk openly about money values and effort. And it caught fire because people were hungry for truth, wrapped in experience, and she had plenty of it to share. She traveled from state to state, hosting forums in both elite universities and rural schools, where she sat on plastic chairs, eating local meals and speaking from the heart. She would say things like, luxury is a reward, not a birthright. And if you inherit a house but not the humility to clean it, it will become a prison, not a palace. And those words stuck because they came from a woman who had lived every chapter of her advice, and her foundation adapted too. It created mentorship pipelines, matching high potential youths with older entrepreneurs who didn't just teach business skills, but life perspective. One of her mentees, a young woman named Zainab, used a 50,000 grant to start a mobile tailoring service by her third year. She had two employees in her own mini shop, and she would often say, Mama Desua didn't just give me money, she gave me eyes to see what I could become. And that was the kind of ripple effect Adazua wanted, not charity but change, not followers but leaders. And back home, Tosin and Teniola continued on their separate journeys. They didn't always agree with their mother's methods, but they could no longer deny her wisdom. Tosin's budgeting app grew slowly and organically. He began hosting financial literacy classes for Okada riders and small traders, explaining in Pidgin how to manage daily profits and stretch savings, and his grassroots approach gained him attention from a Lagos-based NGO that partnered with him for outreach initiatives. His proudest moment came not from a bank transfer, but from a woman in her 50s who hugged him after a seminar and said, nah, you make me know, say money no, be enemy just teacher. Teniola's podcast, From Clout to Clarity, reached its 100th episode with a special guest, none other than Adesua herself. The episode trended for a week, not because it was scandalous, but because it was real. A mother and daughter unpacking the cost of fame, failure, and forgiveness in front of thousands. And for the first time publicly, Teniola thanked her mother for saving her from herself. She said, I thought, you didn't love me when you cut me off, but now I know that was the deepest kind of love, the one that lets go. So I could grow, and viewers across the country wept because they saw themselves in the pain, the pride, and ultimately the peace between them. It reminded people that healing is possible when humility enters the room and beyond the family reunion. Adesua's story began to inspire policymakers, educators, and even media producers. A Nollywood director approached her to adapt her life into a miniseries, and while she was hesitant at first, she agreed on one condition, that the story remain authentic. Not glamorized, she wanted people to feel the weight of sacrifice, not just the shine of success. And when the show premiered, it sparked national conversations about parenting, privilege, and the fine line between provision and poisoning. And through it all, Adesua remained grounded every morning. She still walked through her markets, inspecting stalls, chatting with old friends, and mentoring young mothers who brought their babies to work because they had no childcare. She never let her public image overtake her private routine, because she believed that greatness is not measured by applause, but by consistency. And she would often say, what's the point of changing the world if you forget how to greet your neighbor? And that is perhaps the final secret. To her influence, she never lost touch with her roots, and because of that, she never lost touch with her purpose. And if we're being honest, we all know someone like Adesua, a teacher who went unpaid for months but showed up every day, a grandmother who raised generations from one-room kitchens, a community elder who gave more than they own. These people are the silent architects of society, and Adesua gave them a voice through her journey. She made it clear that strength isn't loud, it's lasting, and legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you lift while you're here. And as she grew older, she became even more focused on teaching, not through lectures, but by living. She mentored future leaders, hosted financial freedom retreats, and even sponsored therapy sessions for single parents dealing with burnout. She understood that real transformation isn't just about money, it's about mindset. And the more she gave in wisdom, the more she received in fulfillment. Her children, who once saw her as a bank, now saw her as a blueprint. In her community, who once envied her wealth, now celebrated her impact. She had become something few achieve in one lifetime, a living legacy. In the twilight of her life, Atsua found peace, not in silence or solitude, but in the echoes of the many lives she had touched. Her home was no longer just a mansion. It was a symbol. It had once represented comfort, then conflict, and now completion. Visitors came from across the continent not to admire the chandeliers, but to listen to the woman who once walked away from everything to protect what truly mattered. Her days began with prayer, her afternoons with teaching, and her evenings with reflection surrounded by journals, letters, and hand-drawn business plans from her mentees. And while her body began to slow, her spirit remained fiery, always eager to correct a lazy excuse or offer a word of wisdom. She was often asked if she regretted her past, especially the decision to cut off her children, and she would smile and say, "I don't regret pruning the tree. I regret waiting so long to do it, because now the fruits are sweeter, the roots are deeper, and the leaves are dancing again." Her message was, clear love without discipline is chaos masked as kindness, and no inheritance can replace integrity. She believed that children are not just gifts, they are assignments, and that parents are not ATMs. They are architects, builders of souls, not just providers of stuff. And as Tosin and Teniola grew into responsible adults, they began to understand this truth on a deeper level. They no longer relied on their mother but respected her more than ever. They started contributing to the foundation, not just with money, but with ideas and presence. And when Adesua fell ill briefly, they were the first to stay by her bedside, not out of guilt, but gratitude. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And this shift marked the final transformation of the family, not into perfection, but into purpose. A purpose that had taken decades to unearth, but was now fully alive and aligned one day during a private event with her foundation's top graduates. Adesua shared her final teaching. She gathered everyone under a massive baobab tree, a symbol of strength and legacy, and asked them a simple question. What do you want your name to mean when you're gone? The answers varied. Freedom, courage, resilience. But her answer was quiet yet powerful. I want my name to mean seed, because seeds don't live forever, but they create forests. And that was the last lesson she gave, and perhaps her most profound, that our lives are not measured by how much we keep, but by how much we plant in others. And this is the message we must all carry forward, whether you're a parent, a teacher, a leader, or just someone trying to find your own path. Understand that true impact begins when you choose values over vanity, when you teach responsibility instead of replacing it with rescue, when you stop fearing that tough love is cruelty and start seeing it as the bridge to growth. Too many families are stuck in cycles of entitlement because no one dares to say, enough is enough. No one wants to be the villain in their child's eyes. But Adesua showed us that being the villain for a season can make you the hero of the long game, that you can be hated for pruning, but loved for the harvest that comes later. And this is not just a Nigerian story. This is a global lesson from Wall Street to Warri, from Detroit to Dakar. The balance between love and legacy is the same, and we must all ask ourselves, what forest am I planting? What values will outlive me? What story will my children tell, not just about what I gave them, but about who I made them become? Because in the end, our wealth will fade, our titles will be forgotten, but our values will whisper in every room our descendants enter long after we are gone. So let Adesua's journey remind us to lead with wisdom, give with purpose and love, with both our hearts and our heads, for in that balance lies the power to not only change our families, but also our world.